Michael has earned a PhD in Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic languages, and an MA in ancient history, as well as an MA in Hebrew studies. And so, in layman's terms, this just amounts to the fact that he is a very, very smart fella. So, it's an honor and a pleasure to welcome Dr. Heiser to Beyond Extraordinary. Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Some people would say that indicates I'm also a very boring individual. So yeah, I get that.
I highly doubt it. I think you're a font of knowledge, and when I kind of got involved in this, I don't know, I guess we could call it fringe Christian world. It's our sort of niche. Your
Yes,
name,
you can call it that.
we'll call it that. And your name gets mentioned so much from people. I mean, well before I knew who you were, everyone would say, you got to read what Dr. Heiser says about this topic and that topic, and your resources have proven to be so valuable. So it's really, really cool to get a chance to talk to you, and I'm gonna pick your brains about all kinds of stuff.
I'll pick away. Just don't ask me about my fantasy teams.
Oh,
I I have not had a good week.
well, I'm not extremely sports minded, but I do have some friends who have been following, March Madness and all of this stuff. And I think there's just disappointment across the board.
Yeah, it's been you might have a few people listening that are in a fantasy baseball league that I start, and like I said, I have not had a good week.
Oh man. I used to really, really be into baseball. In fact, I even made a trek to Wrigley Field to see the Cubs play. So I know all about disappointment.
You're a pro.
I really am. So, hey, before we really get going here, I have to touch on current events with you a little bit, or rather, one big current event, which, if my Facebook and Twitter feed are to be believed, is the number one thing people are talking about right now, and that is the recently released film Noah. And you just posted an excellent review of the film, and I'll link to it in the show notes. But can you give us a synopsis or an overview of your impressions of this film? Everyone is talking about it.
Well, I think Noah is sort of boy, it's kind of a hodgepodge of traditions. So I guess if you're the kind of person that isn't going to be irritated by going to a film called Noah and not having a clean retelling of the biblical version of the story, if that's not going to irritate you, then you'll probably, I guess you could say, I mean, for me, it's hard to use words like liked and hated and enjoyed and didn't enjoy, because it was just sort of an odd film. And in my little post about impressions, I compared it to The Matrix, which I really liked. I thought the Matrix was really very clever, because it combined elements of biblical studies, Christianity with Gnosticism, and a whole lot of other stuff sprinkled in there and blended up. But it was all that information was sort of used in very clever ways, and I don't feel that way about Noah. I think Noah dumps a whole lot of things in the hopper, and really isn't that terribly imaginative. But so I was disappointed in that regard, but it's visually stunning, which I expected. And I think if you're of the mind that, hey, let's just go see this Noah film and see what different traditions say about it, chances are it's going to be in there somewhere, and it's sort of an amalgam. So if you're curious, if you're sort of the curious moviegoer, I think you'd be fine with it. If you're not, if you're expecting and sort of demand, something that feels only biblical, I think you're going to get irritated by the film.
Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't be in the camp that says that all Christians should adamantly boycott this film?
Oh no, I wish, that what I was hoping would happen when a few years ago when it came out that this was going to be a film and it's going to have Russell Crowe, and the one initial news item was that it was going to have watchers, and I thought, well, this would be great because, it books like First Enoch are floating around in the heads of writers like Peter and Jude, and so I thought, well, this would be a really good thing to expose people to stuff that early Christians read, and stuff again that was floating around in the heads of certain biblical writers, and so I'm all for exposure to again stuff that early Christians would have read and that help them articulate whatever it is they're writing about at a given point in Scripture. But to me, it sort of fails that way because there's a lot of stuff that is very late, Kabbalistic traditions, Gnostic, ideas that sort of subvert, I think, anything that would have been a good segue for people into reading ancient material that, again, really helped frame, biblical thinking, even if it's not Scripture itself. So I'm all for exposure to things like that, but again, this is only going to do that part of the way. So I'm still a little disappointed with it. But as far as, it's not, Alexander Scurvy reading the King James, to stage actors, if that's what you're looking for, then I don't know what's going to make you happy or what's going to stimulate your thinking.
Right. I think people are just looking for a revival of like the old Cecil B. DeMille Ten Commandments type movies, and they want all of that. And this is not that movie. It has rock people in it.
Yeah, and I think the Ents would have just shaken their heads,
Yeah.
Because like we've seen that before, and that's actually a good example. In this movie, the Watchers are essentially rock people crossed with Ents from Lord of the Rings. But we've seen Ents before. We've read about them. We saw in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Why don't you do something creative with it? And even better, why don't you actually just go do what First Enoch does with the story? Because there's plenty of really good movie kind of stuff in those books. Why come up with something that, to be kind of honest, with your listeners, is just kind of dorky. I didn't understand that, why the choices were made there, but again, I wasn't a consultant, so.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, why go to these sort of ridiculous inventions when if you made a book strictly or a movie strictly based on what is in Enoch, my gosh, you could have an amazing special effects, intriguing extravaganza.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of just defies explanation on that level. I would say, if you want a movie that really is a good theological discussion starter, I would pick something like Signs, which the M. Night Shyamalan film with Mel Gibson. That to me is just, I think every Christian ought to see that movie.
Yeah.
But you just have to pay attention to it. I don't know. I assume you've seen it.
Yeah.
But it's so. It's just from start to finish, a wonderful introduction to the whole idea of providence.
Yeah.
But you have to pay real close attention to it. But it's intelligently done. It has really good messaging. It's very thoughtful, and it's also in some sense provocative too, because the characters, the way they struggle with their faith and so on and so forth. But Noah's not going to get you to do that. It's not going to feel uplifting. It's not going to be something like, well, let's just sit around in a small group and talk about this biblical episode. There's just so much else thrown into the hopper that it would tend to be a distraction.
Yeah, that's actually a really good suggestion. If there's Bible study groups out there or small groups out there who want to watch a film that really could spark an intriguing discussion, I would second that, to watch Signs and discuss that on a very on the minutia of what's going on in that movie. That's a really good suggestion.
Yeah, it's a terrific film.
So let's go. I was thinking today about all of your academic accomplishments and your published works and your website, and it occurred to me that I don't know much about your early history or how you came to your faith. I do recall hearing that you've always loved things that are old and weird, which really resonated with me, which won't
Yeah.
surprise my listeners at all. But uh, because it happens to be my area of interest, and particularly as myself, I become older and weirder. I would love for you to talk a bit about what drew you to your chosen areas of study, and if you would also speak to how you came to your faith. I think that'd be really
hmm
interesting.
Well, I didn't really have anything that you'd call a spiritual upbringing, really from any angle. Nothing positive, nothing really negative. It just wasn't a factor. Um, it's interesting, how much later in life I came to learn that people within my immediate and extended family were believers. And so there were some influences there, but nothing really overt. That you'd think of as raising your kid in some sort of spiritual tradition. Um, it was really when I was about 9. My grandmother moved to a particular house, and we were helping her move. And the kid next door was the same age as me, and so we met on that day. And it was through him, actually. His mom was a very strong Christian, divorced mom, had 4 kids. 2 of them had cystic fibrosis. Just really, life was just a struggle for this woman. But uh, she really, again, tried to be a good testimony. I was over at their house all the time. They would read the Bible, and I was always invited to stay. And I mean, I didn't know anything. I didn't know who Adam and Eve were. Just a total blank. And I would marvel that these kids could like answer her questions, and it just kind of freaked me out. But that was sort of my first introduction to anything biblical or having to do with Christianity. And this guy became my best friend growing up, through junior high and high school. So that was really my immediate link. And ultimately, it was through that family when I was a teenager. I was a sophomore in high school that I was really exposed to the gospel. It's sort of a very clear articulation. It wasn't my first time hearing it, but it was just, that was sort of the time where it clicked for me. And I was always I wasn't a rebellious kid. I was the boring one, I guess we'll put it that way. I didn't, act out. I was pretty quiet, very sort of introspective, that kind of thing. But when I understood that it really wasn't about, me and how good I was, or how anything performance oriented, but the fact that I wasn't perfect, I didn't have to really be convinced of that. I knew that, even though I wasn't, what you'd call a quote unquote bad kid. But as soon as I sort of got a sense of, well, how does God look at me? And God's perfect, and there's this thing that the Bible talks about called sin, and all that sort of stuff. It really just dawned on me that there's a problem here between me and God. I don't see a problem between me and other people. I get along with everybody just fine. But this is an issue. It has to be settled. And again, I heard the gospel very clearly, that what Jesus did on the cross for me. And I can remember when I was, again, a sophomore, just laying there in my bed thinking about it. I said, I just need to talk to God about this and get this settled. And so I did, and that was that. I went to sleep. There's no dramatic conversion story, that I was weaned from a drug habit or anything like that. And I love to hear testimonies because, to me, it doesn't have to be dramatic. I like the small providences of a person's life story, because that I actually identify with more, as opposed to the more spectacular, sorts of things. So. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I became a Christian when I was in high school, and I just immediately had a desire to read the Bible. Like let's find out about all this stuff. I'm it seems to be the only one in my immediate circle here that cares about this, I want to know. So I read through it in high school, and it really fed into my geekiness, to be honest with you. Because I do remember in junior high, in seventh grade, sitting in an ancient history class, and the guy was talking about the pharaohs or something, and I remember sitting there thinking, this is what I want to do. I want to be a crusty old professor, that you see in the movies and all this kind. This is what I want to do. And when I became a Christian, it was like, well, you're reading all this old stuff, and the content of it, a lot of it is unusual and strange, and it fits within the world that I was already interested in, ancient history. So it was just a natural fit, and I geeked out on it. I read through the Bible completely in my sophomore year in high school. I would come home and I'd read 10 chapters a day to get through the thing, and didn't understand a lot of it, but I did it. I was the kid in study hall as a high school senior. Other guys took Hot Rod, or Sports Illustrated. I'm sitting there with a commentary. Again, I geeked out on the whole thing, but I couldn't get enough of it. It was just fascinating. And I didn't have any direction as far as what to do with my life. My parents, neither of them had been to college, and I remember I took my PSATs, and you have to put something like, where do you want the scores sent?
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea. So I went to high school with Sam Bowie. NBA fans will know that name. He was the guy drafted ahead of Michael Jordan. And so, Sam's going to Kentucky. Well, let's put that in there. That's what I did. I just had no direction at all. And, I went to church one week, and I said, well, I'm graduating soon. I don't really know what to do. What do you think I should do? I'm asking my pastor.
Mm-hmm.
He's, well, you like scripture and theology. Why don't you try Bible college? Oh, okay, I'll do that. I mean, it was just like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like there wasn't a whole lot of questioning, like, well, what do I do as a career? I didn't even think about anything like that. Again, it's a wonder that I'm even employable today. I've had lots of decisions made for me providentially, and I say that in all seriousness, where I would just, oh, well, there's the door. Well, let's walk through that one, and that's the way my life has been in many respects. But I wound up going to Bible college for a while. I eventually graduated from college. I went to a year or two of seminary. I knew I wasn't cut out to be a pastor. I understood that pretty quickly. I don't have the patience for it. I would be a really bad pastor. I really would. I mean, I can see people like coming to me for the third or fourth time, and Pastor, what should we do? Well, did you do what I told you to do last time? Well, no, it's just a struggle. Well, I don't really have anything new to say, so just don't come back. I mean, I can see myself saying that and really alienating people. Like, this doesn't make any sense to me. It's so obvious what you should do. I can't really add anything. So why are you here? Again, I would just be horrible. So I didn't finish with seminary, but I decided, well, I want to go to graduate school, and that's where I made a conscious decision. I could have gone anywhere. I could have gone New Testament theology, church history, whatever. I really liked languages too, and I was good at that because I had a good short-term memory, and I enjoyed it. But I thought, where are the most problems? What part of all this stuff is the most difficult for people to wrap their minds around, and what presents the most problems? And for me, that was Old Testament and ancient Near East. I just thought, this is the most foreign, the strangest, the most points of disconnect, for people who are interested in the Bible. So that's what I'm going to do. And each place I went, I hoped that it would be harder and more antagonistic to my faith, because my attitude was, I'm going to take your best shot and see what you got. And I just felt that at the end of the day, none of this stuff that is going to be new. These questions are going to have to have been asked 100, 1,000 times before, and people have done research on them. And so when I encounter an issue, I'm just going to go look for an answer. I'm not going to accept what the professor says, even though he might be a nice guy and she might be the leading authority on this or that, but I'm going to go check things out. I want them to tell me what I need to think about, and then I'm going to go after it. And so that's how I approached, my graduate education. And it took me forever to get out because I had to work full time doing it. But I wouldn't trade that experience either. I think it kept me grounded. I come from a real blue collar background. I don't have a whole lot of patience for academic elitism, even though with the job I do now, I travel in the upper echelons of academia. But there are a lot of really normal people there. There are a lot of stuck-ups there too. But you meet good people at all levels of it, and I wouldn't trade again the road that I had to go through to get here. I think it was good for me.
I really find that interesting because I think a lot of people, when they feel sort of led in a particular direction, even if it's just a gentle nudge and you're kind of thinking, oh, okay, I'll try that. I think so many people second guess it and they try to do what's expected of them rather than the direction that maybe they're more led to go. And you speak to how there was this providential move that you probably didn't even realize was happening at the time.
Oh, I didn't. I was clueless most of the
time. I think that can actually really hopefully resonate with some people who are sort of struggling about doing what they love, what they're pulled toward doing, and what versus, we all have these familial expectations on us, and what we should be doing versus what maybe we're supposed to be doing. I really enjoy hearing that.
I am a believer that you should try at least to do what you love, and if you can't do it vocationally, you should find a vocation that can fund or provide time to do the other, just on a personal level. That you get to do things that you're interested in, that you really enjoy. And people will, if you really are deliberate about what you want to do, and it's not all about money, you will have people second guess you and put obstacles in front. I had people in churches, Christians. I mean, even people that I was related to, asked me why I was wasting my life doing biblical studies. You're so smart, you should be a doctor or a lawyer. I mean, all they're thinking about is the six-figure income.
Mm-hmm.
And my guidance counselor, I remember being a senior, go to the guidance counselor, well, what do you want to do, Mike? If my answer would have been, what do I need to do to make six figures as an income? They had those answers immediately. But right. if the answer was, well, I like ancient history and biblical stuff, what should I, I mean, they had no idea at all. And neither did I, so it was sort of a wash. I wasn't discouraged from anything because they couldn't tell me anything else. But I just think it's important, to get some satisfaction out of things that you really enjoy doing. It's great, if you have a job, and I do. I feel blessed that allows me to do what I'm most interested in. But even short of that, I'd still be doing it. I would be finding ways to do it. So I would encourage people to pursue what they're interested in.
Right.
Just try to be strategic about it.
Certainly. I can recall when I was younger, there was all of this expectation on me, when, teachers were trying to put me ahead grades and stuff like that. And so I had these very successful people in my family that were doing the same thing to me. You should be a doctor, a lawyer. Everything was money motivated. And I remember, this is just a side note, my grandfather was a Lutheran pastor. And during this big conversation at my grandparents' house, there were all of these people saying, I was involved in debate and all of that, and everyone thought she's going to be a justice, or something like that. And my grandfather just kind of quietly said, well, I think she's going to speak about the gospel. I think that's what she's going to do. Now, at the time, I was like, yeah, right. None of the above. But, and of course, I went through years of being stupid, and, that's a whole nother story. But, here I am. And I guess the hand of God was moving me through these different avenues as well. And there was definitely truth in what he said too. So I think that's really good advice. Um, the first time that I reached out to talk to you was with regard to, I was looking for information on something to do with, of all things, I think a translation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, something really random. And I was doing research for an article that was about the Hebrew Roots movement, if you kind of remember that conversation. You were so kind to help me kind of work through this, and ultimately I was able to put this article together about that topic. Now, this was some time ago, and I kind of hoped that it was something that maybe was just bubbling to the surface because it was Christmas time and everybody thought we were evil pagans if we celebrated Christmas or whatever. And but it doesn't seem to be going away. And I know that a lot of people, very sincere people, I will say, in the audience listening right now, are really involved in this Hebrew roots thing where they're adhering to the feasts, and they're going through all of this stuff, and they seem to become really obsessed with it, to the point where they look at the rest of us, I'll say, as being in error. And I kind of relate it to atheists and humanists and secularists. They have a tendency to do the whole comparing Christianity to paganism, whether it's Jesus was based on Horus or Mithras or whomever. And I find that the Hebrew Roots movement, maybe not even realizing it, kind of does almost the exact same thing, whereas they're not saying Christianity is based on pagan roots, but they're saying, everything that Christians do is based on pagan roots. Because of your research into biblical history and your scholarship, could you speak a little bit to maybe the error of the Hebrew roots thinking? Because it really doesn't seem to be going away. It seems to be getting bigger.
Yeah, I think generally, again, I'm sympathetic to, let's just be blunt about it. I meet lots of people that are not only bored with church, but church really is not meeting either fundamental needs they have as far as teaching them, Scripture, but church almost, becomes about anything but content. And I understand some of that it's supposed to be community and all that sort of thing. But if you're someone who really thinks about content, good luck with that. There are just so many churches that I think the leadership and even the people, I think, foster it, that they're almost content intolerant. And so people want to fill that void. And they also, I think, in the modern church, there's a lack of connection to the past. I think that just sort of comes with postmodern baggage. But the Hebrew Roots movement seems to me, again, just the little bit of exposure I've had to it, seems to be an attempt by people that's sincere, to connect with the past, to get into Scripture more, to have it be more meaningful. But I do tend to, I have seen, I know people that sort of, live in this orbit, part of which is the Hebrew roots thing. And I'm not going to make sweeping generalizations, but there are people that really do. It becomes sort of cultish. So I would agree with that. I think that can happen. The whole paganism thing, I think people that gravitate toward that would be shocked at how even biblical writers interacted with quote unquote, truly, pagan material to, address theologically, but they would include it, in scriptural writings. I mean, there are places that quote from the Baal cycle. There are other passages that follow the Baal cycle. This is pagan literature, but it's done for a reason, and it's done, I think, for tactical reasons in terms of the theological messaging. But the fact that it happens, would, I think, really rock people, and is frankly contrary to this concern that they have. Yeah, maybe you're correct that this thing, okay, this thing we do on Christmas, or this ornament that I have in my house, has some sort of attachment to some pagan tradition that was prevalent in the wider culture, a millennium ago. But had you never said that, I would have never even thought, I would never even had any sort of intellectual connection to it at all. And so, there's that issue. There's a disconnect there. There's the whole issue of intent. Okay, when biblical writers and other people that we would respect in the early church are interacting with pagan material, they do so deliberately, but they don't do it, with the intent of worshiping another god. There's no question of their loyalty to which God are you loyal to, and so that's kind of the filter that I see a lot of these things through. If a Christian, is doing something on a particular holiday, and they consciously know and are glad and in a participatory way want there to be a connection to some pagan point in time, some pagan idea or practice, well, I have a problem with that. If there's just no intellectual connection there at all, there's no direction of the heart at all toward any of this stuff. In other words, it's utterly foreign. It is literally from another time and place and has no connection to what we're doing here at all. I don't see why it needs to be made an issue. To me, the direction of the heart is important. What's going on inside a person's, head is important. You can, frankly, you could make bad use of a lot of good things, even in Scripture, that would give me more concern than something that, people they're not even there. They're just not there in their head or their heart. And so for you to put those thoughts there, I don't know that really serves a good purpose.
Amen. And I hope everybody out there is listening, because Easter is right around the corner, and that's going to open up a whole new can of worms.
Yes, I on another level though, I'm a little bit divorced from this. I mean, I think, and again, I'm not saying that Catholics are worshipers of the devil here,
Mm-hmm.
but Catholicism has more of a problem with this because of its antiquity and because of its roots, decisions made, very early, even before we had a Catholic Church, but even before and then during and since that thing we call the Catholic Church was started. I mean, they're making deliberate decisions to syncretize religious events, religious ideas, religious symbols, and we can look at that and say, well, that's kind of a goofy way to do evangelism. It's kind of an odd way to make people Christians, and I do think it's odd. I don't really see anything scriptural about it. But their motivation, even then, was to Christianize. Again, I'm not saying it makes any sense, but now you move ahead 1,500 years, and Christians in that tradition, or even outside that tradition that are sort of peripherally related to it, are living with some of these trappings, even like something as basic as the calendar, based on these decisions that were made, earlier. Well, if you're going to, follow these traditions, you may not have any idea, where they came from. It wasn't a decision you made, and even a lot of the people who made the decisions weren't thinking we need to be more pagan. They're actually thinking the pagans need to be Christians, and it's a misguided strategy. Again, we live with the fallout of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just tend to look at this and say, why do I need to inject this thinking into a person's head? Yeah, the people who do that are thinking, well, if they're really sincere, they'll get away from it. Well, that they might do that. They also might get into it too.
Mm-hmm.
They might be drawn into, some of those ideas, and they might emerge more pluralistic. They might emerge, as something else. You never know. So what's the point?
Right.
I don't really understand how that isn't a misguided strategy on the other side. So anyway, I guess I don't need to go off on too much of a tangent there, but
No, I
I
follow
think you catch
exactly
the
what you're
drift.
saying. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I appreciate your thoughts on that, because I kind of am in the same vein. I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit, Mike, because I have so many things I want to talk to you about. And I had the members of this Extraordinary Intelligence Discussion Group submit any Bible or theology related questions for tonight's show that they might have had. I'm going to try to get to as many of them as possible, but first, I really wanted to talk to you a bit about an area that's kind of a primary focus for me in my work, which is the realm of the supernatural. And I want to read something that you have written on your website. It's You say, spiritually speaking, I want to minister to those whose experience has caused them to feel abandoned by their church or synagogue because their spiritual leadership isn't intellectually equipped to help them or fears real interaction with the supernatural. End quote. Now, I've dealt with this scenario firsthand. In one instance, I was at a wedding rehearsal dinner and spoke to a pastor of this large evangelical church a bit, and he asked me what it is that I do. I told him about my website and a bit of my background and how I often discuss the supernatural through a biblical lens. And this pastor actually admitted to me that he himself had had what he would call an unexplainable or paranormal encounter. And
Mm-hmm.
he told me he could not explain what happened. He had no idea how to contextualize it, so he just chose not to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I mean,
Well, that's
that's
honest.
right, and that's probably how a lot of people handle it, particularly when they don't know how to relate it to their worldview. But I found this to be troubling in the sense that I had to wonder how he would handle it if a member of his church were to approach him with a similar issue. Would he turn them away? Would he simply say, I don't know, or would he help them figure it out? I think this is a problem that we face a lot in the mainstream church. Could you speak to this issue a little bit? This is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I meet people like that, and I personally know. Um, I've had. Let me just put it this way. I've had scholars come up to me at academic meetings and say, "I'm going to tell you a story because I know you won't tell anyone else." In other words, I won't out them,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll be something along these lines. Or I've had pastors do the same thing, and I know people that are in the ministry who, again, have just had that are personal friends of mine that have had just odd sorts of things. These quote unquote supernatural things happen, and so that is not that unusual.
Right.
I don't think people in the ministry or Christians in general are somehow immunized from these sorts of experiences that you could buy a book on Amazon and read about in the wider culture. I don't think we're that different at all when it comes to that sort of thing. And I think you're correct that it's difficult for people who, I'd say for a number of reasons, to process what's going on. And I'm sympathetic to that because, honestly, where are they going to go?
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that this pastor in your scenario would say, well, let me share with you something that happened to me, and do that. In other words, to have some camaraderie there, and basically say, I really don't know how to process this. I haven't given it a whole lot of thought, And if the answer is, when in the afterlife and eternity, God will tell me what's going on here, and I'm content with that. At least they've tried to affirm what the person experienced in that way, as opposed to saying, well, have you been to a therapist? Maybe you need to go get a physical. Did you have a drug history in your past?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those sorts of statements that people get, and I know because people have told me they've gotten these responses that are not only crushing on one level, but are sort of offensive. That you go to somebody that you believe will listen to you, will have a sympathetic ear or a spiritual authority figure, and they basically tell you that you have a problem or some sort of residual problem, and it just is so unvalidating and really unhelpful that it really undermines people's confidence in that person. And if that person's a spiritual authority figure, it undermines their confidence in the faith. I think even if you don't have an answer, the best thing to do is try to affirm, people and validate, their experience on that level, and say, well, why don't we try to investigate this or do something positive, that sort of thing.
Right.
I think it's a real problem that there aren't really a lot of resources that you feel like you could trust. There's not a great deal of teaching. I mean, you're never going to get a seminary class on the paranormal. Mm-hmm. You're not going to do anything like that. I think the worst problem is you're not really going to be taught in seminary to think creatively about theological ideas that could relate to this. Because seminary is typically about getting versed in a particular tradition and learning research strategies and sermon preparation strategies and getting your feet wet and how to counsel people. Pastors have a tough job. They're looked upon as spiritual authorities, and this is not a derogatory statement I'm making about pastors. This is just the reality. This is where the rubber meets the road for them. A Master of Divinity degree is a first theological degree. It used to be called a Bachelor of Divinity. It's where you start. Mm-hmm. But since pastors, this is the degree that most of them have, and that's a whole lot more than the people they minister to are ever going to get into Scripture, those people tend to view them as scholars. They're not scholars. And it hurts them because when they don't have an answer, they feel insecure about that because they know they are the spiritual authority figure for this person. And if I don't have an answer, it's like a chink in my armor, and it's going to hurt this person's faith. So they'll either drive them away or they'll just ignore them, or they're not secure enough. And I think part of the problem is the way we look at them, mm-hmm. not that they have their own personal insecurities. Although I've met people that would apply to, that are in the pastorate, but they're in a tough spot. So it's sort of a quandary. They haven't really engaged material that is out there that could help them because they haven't been exposed to it. And there's really nothing that gets sort of put out in the Christian publishing orbit that can really help them either. It's just a tough spot. So I'm sympathetic on the one hand, but I would also hope, that pastors would put a little more energy again into doing some research in these areas, and at the very least, try to be pastoral in the way they converse with people who come to them with these sorts of stories and these episodes, because there's a lot of them.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because my last episode of this show that I did was I spoke to a man named Bob Cranmer, who prominent politician in the Philadelphia area. He's coming out with a book in a few months here that is about an experience he had in his home that he would term demonic, but it was mm-hmm. it was kind of your run-of-the-mill haunting type scenario in common vernacular. So part of his story is that he was he called himself an evangelical Baptist, mm-hmm. and when these scary things kept happening in his home and to his family, he, of course, went to his pastor for help. And his pastor uh, essentially turned him away, told him to get psychological help for himself and his kids. And as a result, of course, Cranmer went to, well, what are my pop culture references? Well, the priests are
Hmm.
always exorcising the demons. Maybe I should check out the local Catholic Church. And wouldn't you know, of course, to their credit, the Catholic Church is right there, ready and willing to help because they do have at least this supernatural worldview where they're not going to instantly turn someone away who suggests that something like this is happening. And as a result, Bob is now, he identifies as a Roman Catholic because in
Hmm.
his mind, they were the ones willing to help. Um, and I guess the discussion of whether that's good, bad, or whatever, we could have that. But it struck me as just so unfortunate that the first person he went to was his own personal immediate pastor,
Hmm.
who kind of made him feel like he was crazy.
Yeah, it's this is an underlying theme for me in a lot of what I do, especially the book I'm working on now, which is the myth that is true, that first draft that I worked on,
Hmm.
my putter project for the last 10 years, it's now going to be an actual book.
Good.
But in the one of the things I see is, because we are moderns, we tend to think like our culture. And isn't it odd? Isn't it you know tragic might be too much of a word, but isn't it unfortunate that in the story you just told, that the reflex again was not, well, maybe there's some sort of spiritual activity here that I can't really sort of put my thumb on it. I can't attach a Bible verse to it. Maybe there's something going on here that we could label supernatural. But instead of that being the immediate reflex is something psychological.
Right.
And again, I'm not arguing that we should exclude a psychological explanation, because for me that's on the table, but it's not the only thing on the table.
Right.
And again, it might not, depending on what the circumstance is, it might not be the first thing I think of or consider as far as where to take the conversation. But we're so we're what we are. The church, the evangelical church, is dominated by skeptical believers. Which
Hmm.
sounds like an oxymoron, and frankly it is. But the alternative to that is not a gullible believer. It's a believer that affirms that there is a supernatural, a non-material world. And the next step is, well, the Bible may or may not intersect with this specific phenomenon or experience. My own research has taught me that it intersects more than you think it does, if you're not dependent on English translations. But setting that point aside, to affirm that there is something going on here, and the Bible itself may or may not speak to it, because the Bible it never pretends to be an exhaustive storehouse of knowledge on every question and everything that happens in real time. It never portrays itself like that. And so even when it doesn't address something, it does give us theological trajectories that, if we think enough about them, we can try to think theologically about this thing we call the supernatural, and in some cases this particular event. I mean, you can do some good. You can get down the road, a good ways, more than people realize, and actually say something helpful that helps at least orient a person, remain attached to this thing we call the Bible, without concluding that, this is beyond the Bible. The Bible must just be, inferior or something. All these unnecessary conclusions, all these unnecessary reactions to it. It's just really unfortunate. But again, I'm not here to beat up on pastors or anything like that. I don't do that. I would hope that pastors listening to a show like this would say, I need to try to do a little work here. I need to try to think theologically about this, and sort of think outside the box a little bit, get outside of, my theology books, which
Hmm.
create the superstructure through which I view the Bible. you know, in
Yeah.
other words, all these extra things become filters for the Bible, and I think we should have the Bible unfiltered. So, hence what I call my blog, the Naked Bible.
Right.
Um, you know, it, there you can get down the road. You just have to put a little thought into a little word, a little research, because people are out there talking about it, and they're in many cases they're very thoughtful. They might be scholars, even that are talking about these things, and we should not let that discussion happen exclusively outside the Christian orbit. That's a real mistake.
Hmm. Because then, inevitably people will go elsewhere, whether it's, into the occult or seances or even just, the popular TV shows, ghost hunting, all of that. I agree with you. We should have some sort of a response to that. And I kind of want to drill down on that point a little bit because this actually speaks to a couple of people who submitted questions about this. When you can't really turn on the TV now without seeing some kind of ghost hunting program or paranormal related show. And I think a lot of Christians get confused about how to handle that specific issue, the issue of spirit or the issue of ghosts or hauntings. This is probably more opinion related, but what is your opinion on ghosts? Do you accept the common Christian stance that all ghost encounters are demonic in nature, or is there maybe something else at play?
No, if people go up to my website, which I guess we should mention, it's
Yes.
drmsh.com, dr as the abbreviation for doctor, drmsh.com. And if you use the search field there and put in things like Sheol or underworld or even the word ghosts, you will inevitably find you'll get hooked into a series I did on this particular topic, ghosts in the Old Testament and whatnot, because there's actually a lot of material in the wider ancient Near East about ghosts, and some of the terminology leaks over because it's common culture and of course common language, the Semitic language family, leaks over into the Bible, but you wouldn't really see it if you're working only in English translation. So my view in a condensed form is that what we think of as ghost encounters could be one of two things. I think Scripture does distinguish between spirits that are non-human and spirits of the human dead. I think they are separable categories. Of course, they overlap because they're in the quote-unquote spiritual world. So they essentially have the same address, but the terminology, I think, is parsable so that you have this distinction. Well, why is the distinction important? Well, non-human spirits that would appear to you. Now, again, we're not talking about angels and demons here. We're either broader language, quote unquote spirits, ruchot in Hebrew, or we're talking about some other term that is not angel or demon. It's something else, and it can be good or bad. Typically, again in the Bible, the non-human spirits are going to be viewed negatively, and not necessarily because they're malevolent, but they are dispensers of spiritual knowledge. They are resources for spiritual knowledge that are not God. In other words, the only person you can trust with knowledge from the spiritual world is God, or somebody who God has sent. That's the whole point of these commands against necromancy and some of these other practices. The commands aren't there because it doesn't work. They're there because it does. And since we, as terrestrial beings, we're embodied terrestrial beings, this is not our turf. And so the whole point of God giving a command, don't do this, is to say, look, you get over here in this realm, you make contact with a spirit, you don't know what you're dealing with, you don't know how to control it, you can be easily manipulated and led astray and even harmed. So don't do it. But again, there's this whole category of spirit beings that interact with us. Well, the other category, the human dead, the deceased dead, I think is an important category because if they are, believer or unbeliever, you could have, I'll just relate one example, two variations of this. I've had people that I know are Christians. One of them's a pastor. Basically tell me, hey, at a funeral, I saw the deceased person standing by the side, just sort of watching what was going on. Or the deceased person came up to the spouse, touched them, gave him a kiss on the cheek, and that was that. Now, is it possible that God could permit that for some closure to somebody he cares about? I mean, I don't have any scriptural basis to say no, that isn't possible.
Right.
That God could permit the departed spirit of a human person that has a connection with this other human person. Even if they're not a believer, we tend to think if they're not a believer, they must be malevolent. Well, it could be a stepping stone to that person's, spiritual journey. Again, if they can get a pastor to talk to them about this in an affirming way, who knows where it can lead? It might lead them to faith. I don't know. I'm not the master of providence here to know why this would happen. All I know is that I don't have a scriptural reason to say that it can't. And I tend to not make boundary lines or rules for God that he hasn't made for himself. I think that's the safer position. I try not to put the words God and can't into too many sentences because they don't, it doesn't feel like firm ground to me. And certainly if they're believers, I think God could permit that, again, for closure, for some spiritual, benefit, some uplifting, purpose. Why does it have to be an angel? In other words, you get Christians that would be fine if you called that thing an angel. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, the guardian angel came, dressed up as the deceased person. Well, A, we don't know that. And B, that isn't always the terminology in the biblical text. Right. So how can we draw these lines? How can we make these lines so firm that we can pretend, I hate to say it this way, that we can pretend to know what we're talking about?
Sure.
Because we really can't. I mean, all we can do is observe the. Again, I try to be very data driven. Here's the data of the text. Here's what the text can allow. There's a wide net that the text can allow. Within that wide net, there are going to be points of certainty that I can sort of land on, and have a high degree of confidence that when I tell you this, I can point right there. This is the textual reason why I'm saying this. And there are other times when, hey, it's just in the neighborhood. It's something that isn't, ruled out by Scripture. It's not really affirmed. It's not ruled out. But it's in the realm of possibility, and it's within the realm of scriptural possibility, not just stuff that Mike likes. Ideas in Mike's head that he likes, possibility.
Yeah.
I don't want to tell people that kind of stuff. I want to try to attach the discussion in some way to the text, but be honest with people as to how I'm thinking about the text, and just sort of leave it there. But I think that's better, even though I don't always have, completely, here I could parse this verb for you kind of answers, this nuts and bolts, text-based answer. The answers that I do give that are less exact are still tied somewhere. Again, they have theological boundaries to them, mm-hmm. and with that comes theological possibilities that I think, at the very least, can keep people in the discussion and say, well, this really isn't alien. It's not totally, lost on the Bible. The Bible, the biblical writers were somewhere here, in these experiences. They were not unfamiliar with these things, even though they don't say a whole lot about them. They knew what was going on here. They said a few things here and there, and that helps. That's just a whole lot better than go see a therapist.
Yes. Yes, I absolutely agree. And I think it's interesting because everything you said makes so much sense and it seems so basic. But really what you're saying would in a lot of circles be considered really cutting edge. Like, oh wow, a Christian who says it isn't all angels and demons in the spiritual realm necessarily. We just don't hear that.
Yeah, there's no magic to what I do. I tell people, look, there's no trick here, there's no magic. All I do is, good grief, we're living in a day and age where it's novel to try to be text driven. That's all I
Mhm.
do. That's the magic. I don't depend on a translation. I don't depend on a tradition. I don't allow Christian traditions, even ones that I think are honorable and good for you, kind of. I don't allow them to filter the text.
Mhm.
It's really that simple. And the fact that it seems novel should tell us something. It tells us that most of what people do get is filtered.
Yeah.
That's why it looks novel. And I'm not here to poo-poo on traditions either. I'm not anti-creed and anti-denomination. As I say on my website, I'm more apathetic than
Mhm.
hostile. I'm not hostile. I don't really care about these things the way I care about the text. And I know they serve good purposes. Creeds and traditions, they help people, get the lay of the land, so to speak, on certain things. But if you are substituting that for your own study of the text, then you're gonna get what you invest. Okay,
Sure.
you're gonna reap what you sow in that sense. In other words, you're only going to be taken so far, and you're going to run into walls, and you're not going to know what to do. You're not going to know how to think. You're not even going to be exposed to where you can get answers. Where you can do research. Creeds just don't do that stuff. They don't say see also.
Right.
They don't give you a bibliography at the end of it. It's just a creed. It's a distillation. You don't get doctrinal statements that say if you want to find out more information, go look. You don't get that.
Mhm.
So if that's your Christianity, then you're going to hit a wall.
Right.
It's as simple as that.
And it's interesting that you mention all that because a lot of the questions that people submitted do have to do with very denominational type of questions, whether it is, with regard to liturgy or whether it's regard to baptism, when it should happen, when, why, and how, all of these different things. And I think it's safe to say that your answer is to go to the text and find out what it says and not necessarily be so caught up in these different denominational doctrines.
Yeah, I mean, if they help, again, if they give you a framework, and people need frameworks. I mean, I was there. I benefited from having a framework. I sort of stumbled into one. Again, providentially, it was more than that, but it was good for me where I was at the time. But eventually, I got a very clear sense that what really matters is Scripture, is the text. That's the thing that we claim is inspired.
Hmm.
And so that needs to trump everything else. And, you know, there are disagreements between the traditions. There must be a reason for that. I mean, I can't just chalk it up to, well, people just like to be ornery. Okay, no, there are reasons why certain passages are read, different ways by different people, and once you realize that, it takes you into original language analysis. And again, because it was me, it's like, well, I need to learn those, and then eventually, like I said before, I geeked out on the whole thing. It it took me down a road, and I'm not saying everybody has to go down that road. Everybody has to get a PhD to understand the Bible. Hey, you can go a long way without all that stuff, but only, here's the catch, only if you're willing to think outside the box of your tradition. You must be a servant to the text, and that's it. As to the best of your ability, that is what you're interested in. That's the target,
Right.
not does the idea floating around in my head, can I find it in the Westminster Confession? Again, I'm not anti-creedal, I'm not anti-denominational, but I see them for what they are. They are distillations and filters for the text. They have a time and a place, they have an application in people's lives. I understand that. But sooner or later, if you're doing your job, if the pastor is doing his job, people should outgrow that. And what I mean by that is not forsake it, not throw it to the wind, and not saying, oh, this is garbage. They should outgrow it and say, you know what? This is limiting. There are things in the Bible I want to know about that aren't covered here. And there are questions that I'm curious about that just they're not in this material at all. I need to break away in that respect from these things and start focusing on Scripture and not these distillations or these filters. If you're doing your job as a pastor, that's what people should be experiencing. They should be focusing on again that thing that you're telling them is inspired. And if they're not, then I would say you're not doing an adequate job of getting people interested in the primary source, which is the Bible.
That's interesting. And then it encourages people to ask the bigger questions. And, since as we established, we are on the fringe. So I'm going to ask you something kind of fringy. um, a lot of people have been discussing lately, and I've seen a lot of prominent Christian researchers embracing this concept of a holographic universe, something like that. It's true when it comes to matter on the smallest levels, there's not a whole lot there, particularly when looking at things from a quantum level. It isn't surprising that some researchers have taken a step in that direction. For me personally, in my background in the New Age, and studying a lot of that type of philosophy before coming to Christianity, the ideas of a holographic universe and completely immaterial universe, they bring to mind figures like David Icke and others of his ilk, and the whole thing starts to sound a little bit like the concept of living in a matrix or this like invisible web of consciousness, and then it kind of starts to bug me out a little bit. What's your opinion on this? There's a lot of people really, really talking about this right now.
Well, I don't know how you can affirm quanta or even smaller pieces of matter
Mm-hmm.
and come out with a non-material universe.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you believe in anything like a Big Bang, and if you believe in quanta, that they exist, subatomic particles and even smaller,
Mm-hmm.
that's matter.
Right.
So you can't have a non-material universe. You can have a non-discernible universe. I mean,
Yeah.
if you get really, 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 really small, I don't know what I'm looking at anymore. That's a better term.
Mm-hmm.
For that. But the reality is you aren't that small, and your material stuff of which you are made is put together in a certain way that you are a conscious sentient being, and you interact with other beings that are also material, and you can interact with them in ways that your quantum fed brain can process that is meaningful to your consciousness. In other words, this is an awkward way of describing you still have a life in that sense. You still interact with matter on various levels. So you're still something, and if we're dealing with the space-time universe as we understand it, you are somewhere. You are at some point of time. We do have the concept of time. If you start talking about it, you realize that the real issue is not, am I here? Am I in space-time? Do I have an identity? And things like that. And I understand why those questions get asked. But the fact that you can even ask them sort of defeats this idea of a non-material existence and all that sort of thing. So I tend to not process that discussion in such a way that it sort of requires me to deny that I'm having the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And yes, I do have to evaluate things as to whether they make sense or not, because I am this being with neurons and a brain, and that's how what I am works. In other words, I can't escape that.
Right.
So that's a fairly convoluted way of saying, yeah, I think the discussion's interesting, but to draw any conclusions, especially in that one direction, to me it seems not only self-defeating, but it seems incoherent.
Mm-hmm.
It seems it seems to sort of overturn the premise. The fact that I'm having the discussion seems to overturn the premise. But again, I understand the context for it.
Sure. You mentioned time. This is another listener submitted question, and I noticed that William Lane Craig recently, there's a video going around about him talking about time. And
Mm-hmm.
the question is, does God exist inside of time, if we consider time to be a creation, or does he
Mm-hmm.
exist outside of time? I think the common line of thinking is that God exists outside of time and overseas, but when you really when you really drill down into it, it's a little bit more of a complex question. Do you have a take on that?
Yeah, that Craig's video. I mean, he has a book, God and Time, so a lot of his content, whether it's in videos or web pages and things like that, is going to recycle that. So if people are really interested in that subject, and of course Craig's take on it, just go get the book God and Time, or Google him
Mm-hmm.
and with God and Time, and you'll find it. I mean, Craig's answer to that is yes. Craig believes that God exists or existed outside of time before there was a universe, and as soon as there was a universe, he exists in time. And again, he has a description of what that means and why it's important. So, in other words, he has a timeless God without the universe and a temporal God when there is a universe. And he doesn't. I mean, there are certain practical problems with the timeless view of God. I'll just give you one illustration that pops up. If it's true that to God there is no time, okay, past, present, and future, there's no distinction. Everything is just sort of all on the same level to God. Well, then how can God empathize or even identify with a prayer that we might pray, the concern of which is linked to time, something that will happen, something we want to happen, something that did happen to us? In other words, if God is completely divorced from time and it doesn't even register with him, how can he feel with us about our concern if we're time-bound beings and he's not? In other words, how does that prayer even work? How does that prayer even move God at all?
Mm-hmm.
How could God even process it if he's completely outside of time? How can he, there's a whole set of questions that deal with God's ability to empathize with people if he is completely outside of time. And so, a book like Craig's will get into the implications of the different positions, but people can look up again what he says on that, because he goes through all the philosophical questions about even our vocabulary when we use words like when and in the future and all this sort of thing in relationship to God. I think what Craig does is important. I think he does a good job of addressing, the issues. And I just want your listeners to know that, again, part of the discussion that motivates, or part of the motivation for the discussion, are things like how would God respond to us? How could he do that in any true sense? If this was true of God, if he just can't identify with time and doesn't even participate with time. We like to use that to sort of get God out of problems and whatnot, but Craig basically says it creates more problems than it solves, and the problems you think a temporal God creates really aren't problems. So I would direct people to what he says. I think he does a good job of it.
Good. I'll I'll link to that in the show notes. Now, that transitions, we're talking about the universe, we're talking about time, we're talking about creation, and that transitions into the most submitted and asked question that I've received. And, this is the most non-controversial thing I could possibly ask you. But, okay, so I'll frame it like this. When I first became a Christian, I guess in a true sense, where I accepted it and believed it, uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think I did what a lot of people do, coming from the standpoint of, not really having a context for what it is that we should believe, right? And so I kind of bought the whole mainstream line, and which of course related to young earth creationism. Of course, I that's what I was told you have to believe. in
Hmm.
fact in fact, one of the very first episodes of Beyond Extraordinary, I interviewed a guy named Dave Wetzel. And this is not to disparage him at all, but he's a young earth creationist, and that entire episode related to the issue of dinosaurs. Now, I love dinosaurs. I think they're fantastic. I love to talk about them. But he framed the whole thing in the in the context of a young Earth. And at the time, I was just listening to him and trying to absorb everything he was saying. And um, I he said he made this one statement that even at the time, not having a firm stance myself on creation, I it struck me as odd. And what he said was, people need to get to a point. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said people need to get to a point where if they really want to consider themselves true Christians or true believers in the Bible, then they have to accept young Earth creationism. And as I said, even at the time, I thought, what? Are you sure? So over time, on this particular topic, my opinion has matured and evolved, pun intended. Um, let's hear what you think. What's going on with creationism? Old, young?
You know, I would put it this way. I'm a creationist, which means I'm somebody who affirms that there is a creator. In other words, I think there needed to be a first cause. So I believe matter had to have a first cause. I'm fine with Big Bang cosmology again, but that event also had to have a cause. I think the cause had to be intelligent. So I'm fine, with the idea of intelligent design. And of course, intelligent design doesn't disparage evolution. I mean, there are lots of intelligent design theorists who embrace evolution. I
Mm-hmm.
know a lot of them personally. What it disparages is naturalism or pure Darwinism, a non-theistic approach to evolution. So I'm not really bothered by the idea of evolution. I'm not really, bothered by Big Bang cosmology and all that sort of thing. And the people who read my blog, Naked Bible, they sort of know what my position is on this. I don't think that the Bible teaches any view of science or any particular view of origins. I don't think the Bible is about science at all. Now, what the Bible says, in that it affirms a creator, I think is not hostile to science, even though lots of scientists would, want to claim otherwise. But, that position doesn't really account for the thousands and tens of thousands of people who have PhDs in the hard sciences who still believe in a creator, many of whom are Christians. It's not an observation-based position to hold,
Mm-hmm.
to presume that science, rules out a creator. So I don't think, let's put it another way. The biblical writers, the Bible is about theological messaging. It's not about doing science. It's about affirming a creator. It doesn't really worry about giving us a scientific explanation for what the creator did. In fact, there's a lot of things in Scripture that are very clearly non-scientific or pre-scientific. One of my favorite examples is Job 37:18, which talks about the heavens being as hard as cast metal. Proverbs 8:28, same thing. The heavens are hard, solid. It's the cosmology of a solid dome over the earth, which was what everybody believed in the ancient Near East. The biblical writers are no different in this regard. The description in Genesis 1 about the bulk of earth coming up out of the waters, and the waters, plural, are gathered to one place. Well, how does that work? Well, it works if the mound, the primeval mound, is surrounded by water. You get seas because you have different geographical north, south, east, west orientations. You got the hard, solid dome over the earth. You've got the horizons, cut off, the flow of the water. Why? Because that's where the dome ends. I mean, you get all these elements that are common to an ancient Near Eastern worldview that we know is not scientific. And that's because, they're pre-scientific people. It's God's choice. It was God's choice to prompt people at a particular place, ancient Near East, at a particular time, first millennium BC, to write this thing we call the Bible. Okay, they were perfectly capable of doing it. Again, he's the one that chose them, the when, the where, the who. He didn't goof. God didn't muck up the choice. It was a good choice. It was a coherent choice. It's the one he wanted to make. And he lets people give the theological message that he wants given in the language that people understand. So the biblical writers are not speaking quantum physics. They are not speaking, Albert Einstein's equation. They're not speaking Big Bang. They're not doing any of this. They're using the language that they know because it's their world, communicating to people who are going to read the stuff. Isn't that the point? I mean, if they're out there talking about quantum physics, who in the world of the people that are alive when they are is going to understand this? I mean, it just undermines the whole premise of Scripture, of inspiration. It undermines the premise of inspiration. Now, if it's about theological messaging, well, that transcends time. You don't need to be in a particular era to get things like there's a God, he's the creator, he's the God of all these other gods. In fact, he made them, he's superior to them, they're inferior, they worship him. If they don't, they get their butts kicked. All these kind of theological messages that come from Scripture that are very much part of their world, and the meanings behind them transcend any era, any people, any culture. They are ideas that communicate across time. And that's what the Bible does. It doesn't do science. I mean, I could go on with lots of other, Hebrews 7, Levi paying tithes to Melchizedek while being in the loins of his father. Well, I'm sorry, but you cannot have a human person in the loins of the male. If we know where babies come from, we know how genetics works, we know the chromosomes and the division and all this kind of stuff, we know what happens at fertilization. You can only have a whole person inside of a woman who has conceived, okay? If we abandon that position so that we can have young earth creationism, then we're really in heap big trouble in lots of areas of ethics. Okay, it just doesn't work on a number of levels. And I try to tell people, look, you don't have to take these goofy positions. Let the Bible be what it is. Okay, and insist that people who don't like the Bible treat it for what it is. I use this illustration in church, when I'm out speaking. It's like, look, the people who sound the dumbest to me are the atheists and the critics who get all over the Bible for not teaching science. In other words, you're mad at the Bible for not being what it wasn't supposed to be. Are you mad at your dog for not being a cat? Are you mad at your daughter for not being a son? If you can explain why your perspective makes any sense at all, then we can have a conversation. But until then, you sound kind of dumb. I just don't accept the premise. I'm going to treat the Bible for what it is. I'm going to take it for what it is on its own terms. And if you want to have an intelligent discussion about it, I'm going to insist that you do the same. Otherwise, you just sound dumb. It doesn't make any sense what you're doing. So again, that's me in a nutshell. I don't really care about any of the views because I don't think that's the point. I don't think the biblical writer is using the word yom to speak of 1,000 years or an age or an era. I think he's using yom because that's the word you use for day.
Right.
What other word would I use?
Right.
Okay, I'm not packing it with information that's going to satisfy a 21st century Christian who has to deal with Darwinism and advanced physics and all this other stuff. They're just not doing that. If God wanted that information addressed, we would be having inspiration. We'd be getting the Bible now, okay, rather than 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago.
That's interesting.
Anyway, that was a little bit of a rant, but
I enjoy
you know,
it.
I just think a lot of this is just, I think, useless. It doesn't, the young Earth position. I mean, I understand it. It's the tradition I come from, and I know really good people, that take this position. I have friends, lay people, academics that take the position out, and that's okay. I'm not. I don't beat up on anybody. Your heart's in the right place, but when you start telling people that, when the Philippian jailer fell on his knees and says, "What must I do to be saved?" Paul said, "Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and affirm a 24-hour view of Yom." Okay, I have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
That adds to the gospel. Okay, Paul would say, "Don't listen to that guy."
Yes.
Galatians 1. Just don't listen to him. It
Amen.
just it becomes bizarre, and I don't think we need to do this weird stuff to defend Scripture. A lot of it, again, I'm going to lay at the feet of spiritual leaders. This whole thing about we have to interpret the Bible literally. Well, what does that even mean? Because Yom, the same word, day, is used two different ways in Genesis 1 and 2. One is a summary statement of the whole week, the other one's individual. I mean, what does that even mean? Literally. Nobody examines what literalism even means.
Right.
How do we get metaphor? It just fails on so many levels. But the motivation, I guess, is good. They want people to respect the Bible, the content of the Bible. I understand that. But it really leads them into false dilemmas. And some people do not survive those dilemmas.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a shame because they really shouldn't be. You're giving people an either-or fallacy. Either you accept this view or you go off and be a whatever, an atheist or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just a shame. I think in our day, it's actually doing more harm than good. Maybe that wasn't true 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. I don't know. But I see lots of people that take that either-or fallacy and they choose to walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And it just doesn't have to be.
Well, and it doesn't really further the cause of evangelizing either. I sit and I watch a lot of these groups that have cropped up. It's a very big thing. People go into these groups where they try to reason with atheists, and largely it comes from they're trying to convince the atheists. From my perspective, they're trying to convince the atheists of a young earth creationism, and
Yeah.
it gets frustrating because you sit back and you watch it and you're just never going to win this discussion because you're so dogmatic about this one issue. And not only is that all you can see, but on the other end, suddenly that's all the atheist can see. They think that's all you're about, and if they can refute that, then they've refuted your entire belief system in their
Right.
view.
And unless you tell them that there are other Christians that, hey, this guy has a PhD in your field, you might even know him. He's a colleague and he's a Christian too, but he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't really take the position I hold. But if you don't like the one I have, well, go talk to that guy. Unless they know there's an alternative, if they can't embrace what you're giving them,
Mm-hmm.
they've just made the choice in an either or fallacy.
Right.
You have given them a fallacy and forced them to make the decision you don't want them to make.
Right.
It's an all or nothing proposition when it's really not an all or nothing proposition. To me, this is just, it's tragic. I mean, I see too much of this, and to be a little more hard-nosed about on the atheist side. There are really two kinds of people, two kinds of atheists, two kinds of questioners or whatever. There are the people who want information. I'm asking you this question about origins or about what you believe about the Bible because, I'm going to listen to what you say and then I'm going to try to find more. I'm hoping you can direct me to a book or a person or an article. I want information. That's the minority.
Right.
Usually when people want to probe you and want to, get at you for what it is you believe and ask you questions, they typically want to destroy you. They typically want to undermine you. They typically want to affirm in their own head that what I'm thinking is better than what this person's thinking. They're not looking for information. They're looking to, win the argument, and in the same process, make you feel silly about what you believe.
Yeah.
And usually people like that, there's some other reason why their mind operates that way with respect to the Bible or Christianity. There's some issue of personal pain. Maybe a Christian really treated them like garbage at some point in their life, or they just got intellectually slapped around by somebody, or they were, who knows? I mean, there's all sorts of things that just happen in people's lives that if they see a Christian at the end of that problem, or at the beginning of it, I guess I should say, if a Christian's attached to something they don't like or something bad they experienced, then that Christianity becomes a target, and that's what orients them.
Mm-hmm.
So it is useless. It is absolutely useless to engage someone like that in that way. You need to find out what is making this person tick. You need to love them. You need to be what they don't expect.
Right.
Okay. You need to serve them and do what you can for them, and always be consistent about that. And you can remind them, hey, I'm still over here in Christian land, and I still believe what I believe, and I know you don't, but I like you. Let's go out to dinner. Let's go see a movie. Let's whatever we're going to do. You need to be contrary to what has driven them down that road. That's the only thing that's really going to matter with that person. So you have to be able to detect, what kind of person am I dealing with,
mm-hmm.
and do the best you can, with that, and let them know that you're thinking about them, you're praying about them, you wish that you could go back and change whatever it is that happened, but maybe you can't. But what can I do for you now?
Yeah.
That sort of thing. Again, it's just useless to throw a lot of this stuff out, that we throw out at our opponents in this respect. If you get the first kind, the person that wants information, that's wonderful, because then you can sit down and you can get at stuff. You can really have an enjoyable discussion, and you can widen their horizons. Man, there's lots of Christians out there who have your same background, your same credentials. Why is it that they process this question differently than the way you do?
Mm-hmm.
You can have really good discussions, but unfortunately, a lot of them are just in the other camp.
Right. Mike, that is the heart of what I try to do with my website and with my show. And so I almost get choked up hearing you say all that, because really, my goodness, empathy goes an awful long way. And if we can try to see others the way Jesus sees them,
Mm-hmm.
it rather than a foe or someone to antagonize or get into a fight with. My gosh, I mean, that's world changing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that, I mean, we all, those of us who, like yourself, we have websites, we interact with people. I mean, that's what we need to try to do. We aren't
Mm-hmm.
always successful at it. I'll be the first person to admit that. Sometimes I don't think as clearly about how to handle a question or a person that I should. But hopefully, for the most part, I'm able to do that. And if I do it wrong, I can confess that, or just say, hey, I messed up here, and I didn't answer this question the way I should have, and my mind went off in some other direction, and I got irritated or whatever. I mean, that happens,
Mm-hmm.
but it still has to. You got to be oriented by that. You still have to have that trajectory. That needs to be the direction you're headed. We're never going to be perfect and never veer off, but that just has to orient us. And I think that everybody who cares about um, being able or wanting at least to answer people's questions, that when they're sincere and meet their needs, and even when they're antagonistic, again, to find out what is making this person this way, what is making them tick. You just gotta keep thinking about that, because if you don't, you get distracted and irritated and whatnot.
I think that's a really good place for us to kind of wrap up a little bit, because I mean, really, that that is the main thing, right? And I have this giant list of questions from all of you out there that I'm sorry, I'm not going to get to them tonight, and I really like that sentiment as a place to close. And one final thing I wanted to ask you, and I had this written down, and throughout our conversation, I think a lot of it has been answered just by your sincerity and your warmness and spirituality. But I'm going to put it to you, because maybe you can phrase it in a way that people will understand. When we look at things like the Naked Bible, and we look at your academic credentials and the way that you parse this information, how do you, as you see if I can phrase this right, as you are getting so into the nitty gritty of all of this really deep intellectual stuff, how do you not lose sight of the spiritual aspect of your faith?
Well, I actually think that this is one. I'll go back to something I said earlier. I like to hear people's testimonies. What sort of takes me out of the nuts and bolts of it is hearing again about a person's path. And again, I like to hear little providences in people's lives, things that God arranged, and my mind will go back to those sorts of things that I can discern in my own life. And so, again, my orientation is, again, the text. I try to be text driven, but yet at the same time, I realize that, I can look back on my own life and know that God, was active in it, bringing this person across my path at this particular time, at that particular moment, to say that particular thing that just really, frankly, altered my destiny. And when you can look back over your life and you see just pockets of those kinds of things and strings and patterns to those things, I think it really helps to, in my case, sort of get my head out of all the details and, just get an appreciation for the fact that there's a bigger picture here, and what we would call just our Christian experience is really important too. The things that again we experience in life, and the way we can see the unseen hand, being oriented by those sorts of experiences, I think is really just as important as trying to do the best job we can at the particular task God has given us. And in my case, it's to be the nuts and bolts, kind of guy. So I think when I need to be distracted away from that, God will bring things to mind, people, conversations, whatever, things I'll see on the web or whatever, that just remind me that there's actually a story that's going on there. I mean, this is all part of a bigger picture, and you need to think back to this event or that event and know that it's not just an investigation. It's a journey. It is an experience. It is again an encounter that we have with God. With again embracing the idea of God and an immaterial, spiritual, supernatural world. That is part of your life. And so I think that helps me just to remember those kinds of things. And when I hear other people relate those sorts of things, that is really meaningful to me. Unfortunately, I don't hear as much of it as I'd like, but I try to I try to get around people that will challenge me, in those sorts of ways.
I love that. If we're just aware of one another and our stories, and I think we can kind of keep each other in check in that regard. Mike, before we sign off, you mentioned your website earlier. You've got a little something new and different going on with your various websites. It looks like it's a little bit more compact. There's kind of like one-stop shopping now for everything, Mike Heiser. Is that right?
Let's be honest. It's more comprehensible. No, I had a fellow. Yeah, I had a fellow a little over a year ago email me, who's a web designer, and he said, basically, I really like your stuff, but your website stinks. It's confusing, it's garbled, he just had a grocery list of problems. And he said, every year I do a free project that I just feel that, boy, this guy needs help. And he said, this year I want it to be you, because you really need help. And so he did that, and a few weeks ago it debuted, and so it's at drmsh.com. And you're right, it is more compact. All of the blogs are accessible now at that one location in tabs. There's a wonderful search engine on the thing now that you can orient yourself either by the tabs or using the search. Some of the links on the side, the topical links. I mean, all the information of the old site is still there, but I think that it is easier to get to. And for me, as a user, on my end of it, it's certainly easier for me. So, yeah, it's got a whole new look to it.
Mike, thank you a million times for coming on the show. I think this has been a really great conversation, and I appreciate everything that you do, everything you're continuing to do, and really just means a lot that you came on the show tonight.
Well, thanks for asking.
You've been listening to Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina. For the latest headlines and program schedule, please visit extraordinaryintelligence.com.